Everest, Chomolungma, Sagarmatha. 5.5 vertical miles of rock, ice, and snow. In the winter, temperatures can fall to -60. In the summer, up to 10 feet of snow can fall on its slopes in a single day. It lies on the border of Nepal and Tibet. Though far away, it has always had a special place in British mountaineering. It was first measured by the British Survey of India in the 1850s and identified as the highest mountain in the world. They named it after the Surveyor General, Sir George Everest. 70 years later, British diplomats secured permission from the Tibetan government for the first of a series of expeditions.
Before World War II, there was no competition. There was no race, if you see. There was no race for Everest because other nationalities just weren't allowed into Tibet.
There were 7 British expeditions to Everest. A few climbers came close, but no one managed to get all the way to the top. Mallory and Irvin's disappearance in 1924 only fueled the national obsession.
All the pre-war expeditions were British, and I think we all felt, the British climbers all felt, that it was our mountain and we ought to climb it.
After the war, everything changed. Tibet was invaded by China, and the traditional route from the north was shut off. But as one door closed, another opened. Nepal. For centuries, this mysterious kingdom of temples and high mountains had been closed to foreigners. Nepal was fabulously remote. There were no airports, no railways, and outside the Kathmandu Valley, no roads. No one had been allowed to approach Everest from the south, but it had been photographed from the air.
There'd been covert flights over Everest by a Spitfire and a Mosquito round about the end of the war. And photos had taken on these flights showed every step of a way up Everest. And there was no doubt about it, as far as I was concerned, there was a perfectly good route up Everest.
In the autumn of 1951, Mike Ward and a small British party were given permission to make the first detailed reconnaissance of Everest from the south. It was led by the legendary climber Eric Shipton.
Eric Shipton was an outstanding mountaineer and one who'd been to Everest more, I think, than anybody else. He was what you might call Mr. Everest.
Shipton was a veteran of 4 pre-war expeditions, but he knew that an attempt from Nepal would be a very different affair. From the north, Everest stood alone, a huge isolated mass in the middle of the Tibetan plateau. But on the Nepalese side, it was hemmed in by other peaks. At the foot of the mountain, there was a huge broken glacier, the Khumbu Icefall, barring the way to Everest's upper slopes. Initially, Shipton wasn't sure that it could be crossed, but after several nerve-wracking attempts, they found a way to the top of the icefall. They turned back in front of a huge crevasse. But having now reconnoitered the whole area, Shipton was convinced that Everest could be climbed from Nepal. He planned to return in 1952, but back in London, he heard some startling news.
Oh, fantastic.
The Nepalese government had just given a Swiss team permission to make an attempt on Britain's favorite mountain.
C'était fantastique, une surprise exceptionnelle. Nous avons tous sauté de joie.
It was a great surprise. We jumped for joy.
D'entre nous n'avaient jamais été à l'Himalaya.
Very few of us had been to the Himalayas, but we had seen photos of Everest. For us, it was a dream come true.
C'était, je sais pas, c'était un rêve, c'était une découverte.
We jumped for joy. We were so happy.
On sautait de joie, on était heureux, jusqu'au retour.
The British Everest Committee tried to talk the Swiss into a joint expedition with Shipton as leader, but they decided to go on their own.
Well, the Swiss climbers basically were more skilled than the British climbers. A number of them were guides. They were climbing the whole time. None of us were. And there was, no doubt, not exactly resentment, but there was certainly a sense that it should be a British party that went there and had another crack.
At the end of March, they set off for Everest with 14 Sherpa porters. For 30 years, these tough mountain men had been carrying the loads of foreign mountaineers.
Tout de suite, c'était une union, une cohésion excellente entre tous.
We got on straight away.
Des amis de longue date. Non, j'exagère un peu, mais
we were like old friends almost.
Cette sympathie.
A happy team right from the off.
Dès le départ.
Toujours de bonne humeur, ils vivaient.
They were always cheerful, no matter how primitive their lives were. They always looked happy. The poorer they were, the more generous they were.
The head Sherpa was Tenzing Norgay. He'd climbed with 3 of the British expeditions before the war, but he warmed to the Swiss straight away.
The Sherpas and the Swiss were alike, and you know, that's where I think the bonding started. And you know, language can come a bit later. There were mountain people who came from the mountains in Geneva, and Sherpas, they saw these people are very much like us.
The Swiss were so impressed by Tenzing that they promoted him to a full member of the climbing team. He was hugely honored.
He always wanted to be different to other Sherpas. He had a passion to climb Everest. He was not just wanted to climb Everest for the living only.
In late April, they reached the icefall and began threading their way up. After 5 days, they reached the huge crevasse where Shipton's team had halted.
I said, let me try. I'll go down, and if I get far enough, I'll try jumping across.
On m'a descendu un bout de corde, si j'arrive à prendre l'élan puis à sauter dessus. On n'a pas le temps d'être.
There was no time for nerves. I wanted to get across so badly that I just thought, well, I'll have a go.
Je lui dis, j'essaye. J'ai fait 2 essais.
I tried twice, but I couldn't do it. Then I looked down and saw a small ledge. It was about 60 feet down. I got across, and then I climbed up on the other side. It was easy enough. I just felt so proud.
Asper set up a rope bridge, and the others slithered across into Everest's hidden valley, the Western Coombe.
We were the first men in the world to get in there, into this immense space. It was fantastic.
Their success in the icefall encouraged them to have a crack at the summit. Tenzing and the great climber Raymond Lambert made a brave attempt, but they had continual problems with their oxygen sets and had to turn back. just 800 feet from the top.
If we'd had proper oxygen masks, like everyone does now, I'm sure that Everest would have been conquered by the Swiss.
On their very first attempt, they'd gone higher than any of the British teams. The old monopoly had gone forever. On the walk out from Everest, the Swiss had an unexpected meeting at Namche Bazaar with none other than Eric Shipton. He'd just led a group of British climbers to nearby Cho-Oyo, but they hadn't climbed it, even though it was over 2,000 feet lower than Everest. And this was the team which was hoping to take on Everest in 1953.
It hadn't gone too well. We didn't push it hard enough, and I think we ought to have done. I think it, was a bit of a failure, really. We should have gone harder for it.
Mr. Everest had once again been offered the leadership of the British expedition. But before long, the men who appointed him were plotting to get rid of him.
Eric and I, we had just arrived at the committee meeting when we presented with the agenda, and item number 1 was leadership of the expedition, which we thought was rather odd. Eric was in there a couple of minutes, came out and said, I've been offered dual leadership of the expedition. What do you think of that? And I said, I don't think anything of it at all. You can't have 2 leaders. That's asking for trouble. And he said, I quite agree, and he went back and resigned. Everest had been his life, really, for many years. He was very shaken, but he took it very well.
His replacement was a serving army officer and mountain warfare expert, Colonel John Hunt.
He was in the army, but he was unorthodox. The fact that he, instead of playing polo, he wanted to go climbing mountains. We were rather in disgrace when we were first married in Burma, because we used to go butterflying instead of going and playing polo.
It was an awful start. Several members of Shipton's team actually resigned. But Hunt was a charismatic and well-practiced leader, and before long, he'd got everyone back on board and brought in some new blood.
He had these sort of blue eyes, and he approached you, said, George, I've really been looking forward to meeting you, and immediately he put you at your ease. Those are the days when people read Dale Carnegie on how to make friends and influence people, and we felt that he must have read all that, and he had all the techniques. And you almost at times doubted if he was really being sincere, and yet he was.
They spent the autumn scouring the world for the best equipment available. Tents, food, ropes, stoves. If they worked, they left them alone. If they didn't, they went back to the drawing board.
The 1953 team was probably the best prepared expedition ever to come to Mount Everest. Every aspect of clothing and equipment was researched exhaustively. They paid enormous attention to footwear, and in the end, after research by 30 different companies, they came up with this. This boot is actually 2.5 pounds lighter than what the Swiss had worn in 1952. And as they knew now that a pound weight on the foot feels like 5 pounds on your back, that was extremely significant. So this boot is not particularly robust, not particularly strong, but that didn't matter. It only had to last one expedition. The important thing was that it was light and it was well insulated and it kept your feet warm up to 29,000 feet. On the other hand, despite all the elaborate preparations, some of their equipment seems quite primitive by modern standards. The thermal vest, for instance, just didn't exist. This is what Charles Wiley wore, state-of-the-art underwear in 1953.
In March, Hunt arrived in Nepal with 8 British climbers, a cameraman, and a physiologist. They were joined by 2 New Zealanders, George Lowe and Ed Hillary, a veteran of Shipton's last 2 expeditions.
Ed was a little bit of a strong, silent man, quite reserved at the time. Very determined, that's quite obvious. He, I suppose more than most of us, felt that he really wanted to be the one on top.
And finally, there was Tenzing. Following the Swiss, Hunt invited him to become a full member of the climbing team, as well as head Sherpa.
Before he left Darjeeling, he has a very good Bengali friend named Ravindranath Mitra. And he told him that this time, my friend, either I will climb or die.
He wanted an assurance from me, in case of my death, will look after my family. I gave him that assurance. Well, Tenzing, if I get a morsel of food for me, then you rest assured that your children and your wife will die of starvation.
They hired a small army of porters and set off on the long march into Everest. In mid-April, they reached the end of the Khumbu Glacier and set up their base camp. They were joined by James Morris, a journalist sent out by the Times, one of the expedition's sponsors. In coronation year, press interest was at an all-time high.
We did very much recognize that it probably was the last chance. Because the French, I think, had applied for 1954, and then the Swiss again in 55, and one knew that the Americans would be very keen, and that if we didn't make it in 53, we would probably have lost our chance.
Hunt had drawn up an elaborate plan for their siege of Everest. Task number 1 was to get 3 tons of supplies through the ever-changing maze of the Khumbu icefall and across the western Coombe.
I'd seen small icefalls before in the Alps, but the scale of this one is tremendous.
You had these great seracs, towers of ice, and pinnacles and great lumps and strips the size of a row of cottages that could slump down at any moment.
There's an awful lot of sound to it. You know, creaking and groaning. You could hear things falling down. You could actually see towers falling down.
Once the climbers had found a route, teams of heavily laden Sherpas followed, ferrying loads of up to 40 pounds per man. Aluminium roofing ladders were used to bridge the crevasses.
I would always have a good look at how the ladders were placed. At any moment, you could fall in and die. I'd just take everything slowly and then get across as quickly as I could.
And when the ladders ran out, they sent down to the nearest forest for a supply of tree trunks.
You were wearing crampons, you know, like a cat's claws on the base of your boots, and it's not very easy to walk on a round log with crampons. Our committee ensured that the Sherpas were insured in the event of injury or death. And we said, well, what about us? And they said, oh, well, that's up to you.
While some climbers escorted the Sherpas up, others scouted the route ahead or went down to a rest camp at the bottom of the glacier. Nepali runners delivered letters and newspapers about once a week. Tom Bodillan had taken his wife along on his last Himalayan adventure, but now she was over 4,000 miles away.
Every 5 days, I would send 5 letters. What do you write to someone you're fond of? I can't answer that one. I'm sure I told him I was fond of him. I'm sure I told him I was looking forward to his coming back. I'm sure I picked up what he had said in his letters. His letters that year were remembering many of the things we had seen together in '52. I had a lot of things to write.
On May the 7th, he sent her some dramatic news. John Hunt had just announced his choice of men to tackle the summit, and he had been picked to make the first attempt with Charles Evans. If they didn't succeed, Tenzing would get another crack at it with Hillary. But first, there was the Lhotse face, a 4,000-foot ice slope between Everest and its nearest neighbor. Before any summit attempt, they would have to establish a high camp at the top, on the South Col, and porters would have to carry up half a ton of equipment and provisions. Modern climbers don't consider the Lhotse face a major challenge. It's covered in fixed ropes, and today's equipment allows climbers to move quickly over this type of terrain. But things were very different for the pioneers.
This is the kind of crampon they were using in 1953. Compared to a modern crampon, it doesn't clamp that securely to the boot, and it doesn't have those front-pointing spikes which give you so much confidence on steep snow and ice. In addition to that, of course, they were bringing up teams of heavily laden Sherpas, many of whom had little experience of this kind of terrain. And so they felt it was necessary to ensure the safety of their Sherpas that they should cut steps all the way.
George Lowe, Mike WESTMACOTT and 4 Sherpas were given 5 days to prepare the route and cut the steps.
There's a technique to it. This one here spikes it along the top, and this one then takes it out. And if you get it right, you've got a nice shape.
It was exhausting work, made worse by continual bad weather. After 3 days, Hunt came up to check progress.
He was coming up and asking why I was so slow. So I made sure that I got some good pictures of himself and his Sherpa, who were in the last stages of collapse. I knew I was being slow, but I was, each time that they sent up somebody to me, they never lasted the 1 day, and then they went down again.
This is London calling the British Mount Everest expedition. here is the latest weather bulletin. Western disturbance, apparently moving eastwards across the extreme north of Nepal, is likely to cause cloudy to overcast.
Special weather forecasts gave Hunt little comfort. The monsoon was due at the end of May, but what if it came early?
At least 2 of the pre-war expeditions were just defeated by the monsoon because they didn't get high on the mountain soon enough. And what was critical was to try and get established on the mountain before this great mass of wet, warm air currents moved in from the south, bringing with it heavy snowfall, high winds, and impossible climbing conditions.
By May the 15th, Hunt was getting anxious. George Low was still at the same camp halfway up the face, and the sick Mike WESTMACOTT had been forced to retreat. Mike Ward went up in support.
I was not really very fit when I went up to help George Low. The thing that I suffered from on the Lhotse face was that I got progressively colder. And obviously I was frustrated with myself, as anybody would be, but all these things are blunted by oxygen lack.
After 3 days, they still hadn't reached the South Col. So Hunt was forced to take a huge gamble. Low and Ward came down, and the first porter teams were sent up before the final route had been established.
You couldn't really expect any of the Sherpas to go up to 26,000 feet more than once in the expedition. So all the stores that were needed at the South Col would have to be carried once, and one big carry.
But the porters stalled halfway up, unable to go on. So the next day, Hunt sent Hillary and Tenzing up as reinforcements. He'd wanted to keep them in reserve, but he had no choice.
There were times, I think, when the Sherpas were not, probably not performing or, walking a bit slowly or, so onwards. And he would put a lot of stress on them, make them, feel that you're not here for a picnic, you're here to do a job.
Finally, on the 22nd of May, the porters reached the South Col. It was a wind-lashed, desolate spot. All around lay the scattered remains of the Swiss camp. But this was a key moment in the expedition. The race was back on. Dillon and Evans prepared to depart. They were going to use a special oxygen set developed by Tom Bodillon and his father. The carbon dioxide that a climber breathed out was filtered through a soda lime canister and recycled as pure oxygen.
Well, this is one of the oxygen sets which was used on Everest in 1953, and this is the design known as the closed circuit, which was still pretty experimental in those days. Since it's pure oxygen you're breathing, it's a pretty powerful boost, which does more than compensate for the extra weight of the gear that you're forced to carry.
On the 24th of May, they left base camp for the South Col.
Tom was probably readier to take more risks, although he wasn't casual about human life at all. But Perhaps he was more keen than Charles to try and get to the top.
At 7:30 on May the 26th, they left the South Col with 2 oxygen cylinders and 2 soda lime canisters each. At 9, they paused next to the tattered remains of a Swiss tent. At 11, they stopped again.
They changed their soda lime canisters when they had come to a place that seemed safe to do so, but before the canisters had actually run out.
I was going up the Lhotse face and I could see the south summit, and I spotted them up there. I could actually see them.
It was about 12 o'clock and we thought, oh, the south summit, 12 o'clock, they've time to get to the top. Plenty of time. They're going to climb it.
They stopped at the south summit to take a series of photographs. But this was a moment of crisis, not triumph.
They checked their oxygen supply, and they reckoned it might take 3 hours to go along the ridge to the top. And they had just 3 hours of oxygen left, which would mean they'd go off oxygen right on the very highest point on Earth. And there was, of course, a severe danger of them never being able to come down again.
When they'd changed canisters, Charles Evans' oxygen set had frozen up, and he'd barely been able to reach the south summit. He knew that he couldn't go any further.
They discussed it for a time, and Charles said to Tom, if we go along with this problem, you won't see Jennifer again.
The margin was not good enough for them to go up and be confident, at all confident of getting down to the South Col again.
But Bourdillin's own set was working perfectly, and the true summit was just 300 feet above him. He walked along the ridge to get a better look, and then turned back.
When you've only got what seemed like an arm's length away, the lifetime ambition of any climber, that must have been quite a difficult decision. But I think it was the correct one, because if they had gone on and then failed to get back, it would have converted the second assault more into a rescue than a real climb for the summit.
Three hours later, they stumbled down onto the South Col, their oxygen tanks almost exhausted.
When they came down that day in the afternoon, they were absolutely whacked out. I took the camera as they were sitting there, and they were looking back up the top.
Tom Bourdillon said something to me, you know, we should have gone on. We should have gone on. We should have had a go. We should have gone on, you know, should have.
Back in Kathmandu, speculation mounted. Every cloud in the sky was taken as a hint that the monsoon had arrived. The city was packed with journalists, hungry for a story. James Morris was far away on the mountain. they had to make do with rumors. High on the South Col, Hillary and Tenzing prepared to leave. They were going to use a simpler but more reliable type of oxygen set. And they had another advantage. They'd be starting from a camp 2,000 feet higher. But the weather wasn't doing them any favors.
Tenzing, it was scared that they may not make it because the winds are getting stronger. They might retreat. And for a climber, you know, when you've been there so many times, like this is his 7th attempt now, you know, you think, I don't want to come back again, you know.
On May the 28th, the wind died down, and they set off with their support party, George Lowe, Alf Gregory, and Ang Nima. At 27,300 feet, they collected supplies dumped by Hunt and Dar Namgil 2 days earlier. A couple of hours later, they stopped and hacked out a narrow ledge for their tent. The others went down. It had taken a massive team effort to get them there, but now they were on their own.
In the morning, the weather was fantastic. It was a blue sky, very less wind, and they were now ready to go.
They broke camp at 6:30.
Hillary started leading the climb up to the south summit. And when they saw this incredible knife ridge, you cannot make any mistake there, full stop. You are down 3,000 meters drop. I mean, you're dead, full stop. I mean, there's no way you can make mistakes.
On a ledge below the south summit, they found the oxygen cylinders abandoned by Bodillan and Evans on their way up. They were a third full.
That was a great bonus, because it meant now they could have a slightly more generous flow rate on the harder climbing beyond the south summit, knowing that they had that oxygen in reserve for getting safely back down again. And it's that getting back down which is always at the back of your mind.
At 9, they reached the south summit. Evans had briefed them on what lay ahead. There were only 300 feet to go, but in the middle of the ridge, there was one final challenge.
The main trouble was this black portion here, which was a rock step.
Ah, yes.
It was about the actual steep part, about 40 feet. So we realized that this was really the crux of the whole ridge climb.
Even getting up something like this in the Alps is quite tricky. At nearly 29,000 feet above sea level, this was a really serious obstacle. And wondering what to do, Hillary looked at the rocks on the left, didn't like the look of them, and then noticed a bit of a chimney, a snowy crack leading up on the right, and wondered if that could be a way of getting over this obstacle. What you have to remember is that he had 20 pounds weight of oxygen equipment on his back in a great unwieldy metal pack frame.
A lot of the viewers would like to know how you go up a chimney backwards like that. What's the movement with your legs up there?
Well, we had ice spikes, crampons on our feet. By sticking my crampons in on the ice behind and holding on to every little...
Handholds on the rock on your right.
Yes.
And
wriggled up it.
Hillary took a calculated risk, and it looked as though that cornice was stuck firmly to the cliff. But if it had given way, he would have been catapulted backwards over that 10,000-foot precipice.
Tell me one thing, Ed. If that had been a mountain in New Zealand just on a holiday, would you have had a bash at that or not?
I think we would have had a bash at this step, I must admit. But I think we would have hesitated about the snow conditions.
And so, After a huge, bold effort, Hillary reached the top of the cliff. He got his breath back, pulled the rope tight, brought up Tenzing, and the final problem of Everest had been solved. And to this day, that cliff at nearly 29,000 feet is known as the Hillary Step.
They were very close now, but the ridge seemed to go on forever. Then, finally, unexpectedly, it flattened out.
In Hillary's words, the last few whacks of the ice axe and a few weary steps, and they were on top.
At 11:30, they stepped onto the roof of the world.
You can actually see for miles away across towards the Tibetan plateau. You know, you've got this incredible 360 degrees of panoramic view of mountains. And the most beautiful part of it is that you can see the curvature of the world coming around to you. And it's absolutely stunning.
What were the first words you exchanged with Tenzing when you were actually on the top?
Well, I can't remember, actually. With all our oxygen masks on, it was rather hard to speak anyway. But we certainly shook hands and gave each other the odd thump on the back, I think.
Then Hillary photographed all four sides of the mountain.
For Tenzing, of course, it was an incredibly moving moment because this mountain had dominated his life. He'd been born within sight of this mountain. Down on the east side were the meadows where he'd looked after the yaks as a boy, where he'd been born. On the north side was the Rongbuk Glacier, where he'd been on his first ever expeditions and first sort of dreamed this crazy notion that he was actually going to climb Chomolungma himself. And down on the south side was the scene of his near miss with the Swiss, of his brief spell of living in Nepal, Tangboche Monastery, the homeland of the Sherpas. So the whole thing was so redolent of all his total life's experience.
Tenzing buried sweets and a pencil given to him by his daughter. Hillary left a cross entrusted to him by John Hunt. And after 15 minutes, they descended. Four hours later, they met George Low on the South Col and slid back into their tents.
We spent all night talking about what climbs we'd do when we got back to New Zealand. And, you know, we were in such a state of high excitement. We were always talking about where we'd go and what we'd do when we got home and which ones we could climb when we got there.
May the 30th. Down at base camp, they waited anxiously. They had no means of contacting the men above and had seen nothing.
I don't think anybody dared express an opinion. We all must have felt the same, that, well, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but what would we do if they hadn't?
At 2 o'clock, they heard an announcement on All India radio that the Everest expedition had failed. Moments later, 3 figures appeared, far away.
At least we knew they were all there, and that quite soon we'd be hearing that either they'd made it or they hadn't.
Suddenly, when they got a bit closer, George Low suddenly started to dance around in the snow and jab his ice axe in the air, and we realized they'd done it. I James happened to be the only person who was capable of running at that point, so I ran ahead of the others and was the first actually to meet them.
You just see someone like WESTMACOTT just giving him a traditional shake of the hand. It hardly seems enough nowadays. Well, you can see how much it meant to Hunt as well.
And he cried, and no, it was a terrific release.
Tremendously emotional time. I can still picture it.
It was fascinating because we did, in fact, take a photograph of the Sherpas, and they were all standing there like, you know, Englishmen. They didn't feel that they could rush in and start hugging people as well.
The expression that appeared over John Hunt's face. We've done it.
James Morris was there, and we suddenly realised that if we got down the icefall that day, there was a chance of getting the news home in time for the coronation.
They raced down the mountain, and on the following morning, James Morris handed a brief message to a waiting runner. He was desperate to protect his scoop and had devised an elaborate code to throw any spies off the scent. It took a day and a half to get to the nearest village. A few hours to be radioed to Kathmandu, and a few minutes to be carried over to the British ambassador.
My father looked through his code book and he discovered that what the message actually said was summit of Everest reached on 29 May by Hillary and Tenzing.
Then, by Foreign Office cipher, the news was transmitted 4,500 miles and 5 hours back in time to the Foreign Office in London, the Times in Fleet Street, and a small cottage on the Welsh border.
It had a huge bath, an enormous bath in it, and I was bathing all 4 children together in the water when the telephone message came through, and I remember rushing into the bathroom and telling them, and of course they didn't mean absolutely nothing at all to them. It's the only thing I remember about it.
On the following morning, the news was announced by loudspeaker to the huge crowds which thronged the Mall, waiting for the Queen.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the news. Mount Everest has been conquered by members of the British expedition. The news reached London in a message to the Times from...
Its coincidence with the coronation turned Everest into more than just a mountaineering story. As the news flashed around the world, the British press proclaimed it as a coronation gift for the new Queen, the dawn of a new Elizabethan age. But in India, Tenzing's adopted home, it wasn't quite seen like that.
The excitement that an Indian, a lowly Sherpa, that he shared this glory with Sir Edmund Hillary. And this has happened at the time, in an independent India, not at the time when Britain was still here. That, I think, was a matter of enormous national pride.
Within no time, the news was spread all over Darjeeling. My sister Nima and I were very excited. And my mother instantly, made thanksgiving to the gods.
Well-wishers put up the money to fly Tenzing's family to Kathmandu. where they bumped into Joy Hunt, who'd also been flown in to meet the returning team. But as marquees went up around the city, a controversy was growing. Who had actually reached the summit of Everest first, Hillary or Tenzing? The Indian press had little doubt.
The idea that the white man is the leading one, no rubbish, this time we have done it, our people have done it, Tenzing has done it, and why should this credit be misappropriated by others? This was the feeling.
As the weary climbers headed back to Kathmandu, they were sucked into the controversy.
We were all tired. We'd just walked 170 miles, and we were longing. We'd just reached the sort of beginning of civilization, as it were, and we were longing for a jolly good beer and a bath and good rest. But we were being held up by the press.
The one question that the press wanted to ask was who got to the top first. I mean, this was something that had just never even occurred to us.
Hillary had actually stood on the highest bit of snow on the summit before Tenzing, but I mean, he was only a few feet away from Tenzing, and it was of no significance at all, really. But they continued to press Tenzing. Tenzing said, no, no, Hillary got to top first, you see. And they said, well, no, you're wrong, though. It's in the papers, so it must be true. You see, Tenzing got the top first.
A group of 4 people from India, they came to Tenzing and they said, will you give us your autograph? And Tenzing, who had only struggling and learning about giving his autograph, he gave an autograph. And these 2 leapt in the air, the man slept, and we've got it. And what he had signed was, I reached the summit first. Signed Tenzing.
In Kathmandu, Tenzing was received like a god. He'd grown up in Nepal, and now the huge crowds tried to reclaim him from India as their national hero.
There were unfortunate pictures of Tenzing, sort of cartoons of him climbing up to the summit and dragging Hillary after him with a rope round his neck and so on. I mean, that was very unfortunate because, you know, until we met that outside world, we'd been a very compact and united team.
In the days that followed, Tenzing was the star of the show, but the look on his face said it all.
John Hunt gave a press conference in which he was asked, did he think Tenzing was a great climber? And he said, oh yes, he's a very good climber, but you can't really compare him with the great alpinists. This, of course, the reporters rushed off to Tenzing and said, Hunt says you're not a very good climber. Tenzing replied, has anybody else been 7 times on Everest?
Hillary just had to grin and bear it.
He did begin to react and say enough's enough, really, and get a bit fed up with it. But you know, there was so much pressure on Tenzing from the public and everybody that he was really forced into a kind of political corner.
Who climbed Everest first and second? That was... My father was disgusted with that.
Over at the embassy, Hunt and the ambassador advised Hillary to rewrite his account of the summit climb. I cramponed up the ridge and stepped on top of Everest. Became a few more whacks of the ice axe in the firm snow, and we stood on the summit. The controversy died down as they toured India. But it took a personal intervention by Prime Minister Nehru to persuade Tenzing to accompany the others to Britain. During a brief fuel stop at Zurich airport, they met some unexpected friends.
And in the transit lounge was the entire Swiss Everest team waiting for us with champagne. I don't think we would have done that for them had they climbed it. Just, it was marvellous.
Finally, on July the 3rd, they arrived in London. There were more presentations and more medals, but none of the smiles were innocent now. On the mountain, they'd all worked together. But back on Earth, politicians and pressmen had tried to pull them apart.
It was a team effort and it wasn't individuals. It was like building a pyramid in the gymnasium, that you have 3 or 4 people who put their 3 other people on their shoulders and then get somebody else to go right to the top. It takes a long time to do that, but it only takes a second to collapse your pyramid, doesn't it?
My father always believed in teamwork. Without teamwork, it's impossible.
Everest had changed them forever, but one thing remained unaltered: their passion for mountaineering. Tenzing returned to India and became director of field training at the Himalayan Mountain Institute. Hillary set up a charity to build schools and hospitals in Nepal. Hunt and the others raised thousands of pounds to support young mountaineers. All the survivors remain close. Since 1953, over 1,000 climbers from over 60 countries have reached the summit. But Everest remains unbowed.
You mustn't call it the conquest of Everest. It's the one thing John would never do. He was always climbing Everest and not the conquer. You can't conquer a mountain. It's too large and too beautiful and too wonderful. You mustn't ever call it a conquest.
Something mysterious yet fluffy lurks within the Norfolk Broads. Bill Oddie's on the case next. Meanwhile on BBC4, the pressure is on for the staff at the Queen's Castle. The French president is coming to stay.